There are other ways as well that kinship and family are really like the square one sort of society, and one of those ways is economic. So all societies possess some kind of division of labor. There is no society in which every single human being does every single task. Moreover, even the societies in which there is the least amount of specialized labor, which would typically be certain kinds of hunter-gatherer groups that we call like generalized foraging groups, even in societies like that, there will almost always, in fact, pretty much always, be a division of labor by age. There's things kids do that adults don't do, there's things adults do that elders don't do, and so forth, and by gender. So, for example, in many societies, men do certain tasks, women do certain tasks, and we've talked about some of that. For example, we've talked about the fact that in many hunter-gatherer groups, men hunt large game, women hunt smaller game, which would allow for mothers to not have to be sort of lugging around a baby while you're off, potentially for days at a time hunting large game. Instead, you can hunt things near at hand, or in many hunter-gatherer societies, maybe not be hunting at all, but instead be solely focused on plant gathering that you can do relatively close to the home, and certainly is less dangerous for the baby. And so and easier to stop as well if the baby needs to be fed than sort of like a hunting where you're the animal's moving, so you can't necessarily stop. So there are sort of logical biological reasons, if we think of this from a physical anthropology standpoint, that there's a gendered division of labor. And indeed, there's good evidence when physical anthropologists look at our apes that are the most genetically similar to human beings. There's good evidence to suspect that the earliest hominins had a gendered division of labor, that the earliest human antecedents had a gendered division of labor like that. Now, there's a whole lot of things in gendered divisions of labor that have nothing to do with that basic kind of biological distinction having to do with who's going to feed the baby and who is then available to go hunting, right? When, for example, in many American homes, particularly, this is kind of becoming outdated now, but especially a few decades ago, it was kind of the common assumption that the man would do the barbecuing in a heterosexual marriage. Where in the world does that come from, right? I think it's pretty obvious to most of us that that's what we would call social construction of gender, meaning it's really not something that's biologically rooted. It's just sort of something that the culture has decided this is, dudes don't cook except for they do cook in this one very specific domain of barbecuing, right? It's a little strange. But I shouldn't say it's strange, right? It's cultural relativism. We would say, well, it makes sense in that cultural context. So every society has a gendered division of labor. And that's true. Anthropologists and social scientists would argue that that's true even under modern conditions, even in highly industrialized nations like the United States, where it is very, very common for both men and women to be working, and it's very common in heterosexual marriages that even though studies show us that even though in many heterosexual marriages both the man and the woman are working, oftentimes the woman is doing more than her fair share, more than 50% of the domestic labor, as far as things like washing clothes and cleaning the house and nurturing of the children. Sociologists sometimes call this the double burden on women, because it's like she essentially has two jobs, right? She has the job outside the home, and then she still has the kind of traditional caretaker job, which is from an anthropological perspective, we would say that is a job, even though it's not one you get a paycheck for, right? It's a form of labor, a very difficult form of labor. And so every society then has a gendered division of labor. Sometimes it's more obvious than others. And where does that start? And that starts fundamentally in the home. It then grows into other things, right? We then start to label certain kinds of jobs as more typically associated with one gender or another. Such as, for example, if I was to say the term nurse, even though there are many, 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 many male nurses, people tend to automatically think of nurse more often as a woman's profession, which, again, social constructions of gender don't always match actual statistical realities, but they're how, discourses that we're sort of fed within media. But all those kind of ways in which we gender jobs, that's all sort of secondary to a more basic gendered division of labor that exists within the home. And one could argue that the family is sort of the starting point, for better or worse, of sort of gendered divisions of labor. It also becomes sort of the economic square one in the sense that for many societies, particularly prior to agriculture, and I would argue really prior to the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, so for the vast, vast majority of human history, the home was the primary economic unit, right? The home was largely economically self-sufficient or economically self-sufficient in cooperation with other homes. You hunted with your family and gathered with your family, or you farmed with your family. In many horticultural societies, like the slash and burn farmers of much of the Amazon, it's the husband goes out and chops a bunch of wood down and then clears and burns the forest, and then the wife goes and plants seeds and harvests the seeds later. So it's like a joint economic project within the family, right? And in societies like Hopi society, for example, it is a extended family running through the female line that holds onto the land and makes sure that land gets farmed. So it's families, right? Among Tlingit, for example, one of our Alaska Native groups here, one of our large Alaska Native groups here, especially in the southeast region, traditionally, prior to colonialism, Tlingit lands, who had which fishing spot, who had which land to harvest berries, who had which lands to do what with, that was all regulated through clan lines, through what lineage you were part of and what clan you were from. In other words, through your kinship. So kinship's sort of a square one from an economic perspective. For most societies throughout most of human history, your family was your coworkers, and that was sort of the basis. The idea that we have now, where you go to work and work for somebody that you may not know at all, you may have a CEO that you've never met in your entire life that you're dependent on economically. Although that seems very normal to us, that's utterly bizarre from a human history perspective. And that doesn't make it bad or good. It just means that it's unusual. It's a very unusual way we do things now. For most of human history, your economic unit primarily was your village and your family, basically. It's also the case, and this is kind of connected with that thought, that families are sort of the square one organizationally in terms of how societies group up. So I mentioned before the Tlingit, who were organized partly by geographic area prior to colonialism into what are called kwa'ans, but also partly by clan. So sort of this clan has this area, this clan has this area, and so forth. Even an area as large as Australia prior to European colonialism, I said a lecture or two ago that it was primarily organized by religion, right? Different groups had access to different sacred sites, and therefore that became their territory. However, it would be almost as accurate to say that it was organized by family groups, because really the groups that had these specific sacred places were clans, and so it was really organized by clan as much as it was organized by religion, since a clan is a type of kinship group. It's a group of people that are related to each other through a common mythic ancestor. So Aboriginal Australia, a continental landmass that, despite being the smallest continent, is still ridiculously huge, was organized essentially through a clanship, a family genealogical kind of system of who went where. And so that kind of shows you the power in many areas that family groups had as far as your basic sort of who gets what territory. Kinship also forms a square one in terms of emotional. So I put here socially approved intimacy. I don't just mean sexual, although that's where people often go when they think the word intimacy. I also mean more generally that we have tremendous amounts of good research from psychology and other fields to suggest that human beings sort of had not just a desire for, but a need for at least some amount of emotional intimacy. And that varies between different human beings. Some people need a lot more of that than others. But to some degree, most human beings need that to some degree. We're social animals, and we need somebody to sort of vent to and express feelings to and things like that. And we get that in a large variety of ways, but sort of family is often a square one where people sort of experiment with, as small children in their own emotional development, experiment with sharing feelings, what are appropriate feelings, what are not appropriate feelings, and things like that. And unfortunately, sometimes that's not a good environment for that kind of trial and error, but sometimes it is, and that's sort of where society expects us to get our first learning in terms of that. And then finally, kinship affects a whole lot of other things. So one of the things I put here is religion. So for many societies, religion is also very much what am I trying to say here? Very much a matter of kinship. So for example, back to Tlingit. So within Tlingit society, at-on, a traditional concept, a word that meant ownership, but it was the idea that clans owned different things, usually because an ancestor had purchased it, sometimes with their own life. And things that could be owned were things like fishing spots, places for home sites, things like that, but also things like religious stories and religious artwork and things of this nature. So religion is often structured through genealogical lines. I mean, we can see that even in the Bible, right? People are always often confused when they actually read the Bible and see that there's a lot of like, oh, this person begat this person begat this person, taking up several pages of different parts of the Bible. But you really shouldn't be too surprised when you start to understand that Israelite religion before Common Era was very much structured according to the 12 tribes of Israel in this very extent, which was really meant that it was structured through the 12 sons of a man named Jacob. And so it was all sort of a story of an extended genealogy of people that were in a specific relationship with the divine. And so even religion in many societies starts really as a family affair that then sort of gets broadened out to include more people.